kids. I'm here to inform you about your basic human rights. So, the format of this video essay is meant to be pretty simple. We're going to tackle some rights of children, such as the right to medical care, the right of access to education and information, the right to learn and grow in a safe environment, and the right to be consulted on decisions that affect their vital interests. There are 3 sections. First, medical, then education, then judicial. Each section will begin with an interview guided by a question pertaining to each topic. Okie dokie? Sounds good. Let's begin.
Well, I think in the case of my child, I let them know every decision that I make. I will always have my child's best interest at heart. So there's no need for them to get involved. Also, to be honest, my child can barely empty the dishwasher correctly. I don't think they should be consulted on medical decisions. They just aren't old enough to understand how complex this situation is. But they don't have to. Yes, I have a right to know what I'm being treated for and how I'm being treated. Decisions having to do with my body should not be fully in the hands of other people. I should at least be consulted first. I know I'm a minor, I cannot give consent according to the law, but I am rational and independent enough to know what's good for me. And I know some of my friends at school who are being denied mental health care because their parents don't believe in mental illness. Can you believe that? They should be able to seek the care they need regardless of parental permission. It's a case-by-case basis. I've encountered a 7-year-old who knew more about the circulatory system than their parents simply because it was their special interest. I've also encountered teenagers who have a hard time wearing masks because of what some guy on the internet told them. Some adults come in swearing up and down that they know what illness they have because WebMD told them so. Honestly, I think age has barely anything to do with who can be consulted and involved in their medical care. It's all a matter of maturity level. If I believe a child can handle knowledge about their medical care, I'm more than happy to share it with them.
Okay, so yeah, that wasn't totally a real interview, but it is based on an actual study led by Imelda Coyne, the BSc program director and lecturer in children's nursing at Dublin City University. Her objective was to explore children's, parents, and nurses' views on participation in care in the healthcare setting. To quote the study, nurses appeared to hold varying and discrepant views on the involvement of children in decisions, and for some nurses, the child's involvement seemed to be dependent on the child's cognitive maturity and being defined as a rational subject. Health professionals' communication behavior may reflect recognition of children's cognitive abilities rather than their competence to understand. The fact that children's nurses appeared to make decisions about involving children in decision-making in the absence of a reliable framework was a significant finding and highlights a real problem in the current climate. Now let's examine the interview responses. The nurse and the child mentioned words like rational, independent, and maturity, while the parent discussed how their child isn't old enough or isn't capable of understanding the complex situation. It's a case-by-case basis, the nurse said. This brings up a question I have. What methods does the nurse use to judge the maturity level of a child? The rationality. In judging others, we must first understand what rationality is. What is it to be rational? And does age have anything to do with it? To be rational. Rationality is a hard term to define. And honestly, it's probably best that it isn't truly defined. Defining it would keep the term hard attached to its initial meaning, restricting it from future new interpretations. Also, any notion, such as rationality, depends on the context, the system in which it is being defined. In our case, rationality is defined by the values of our society that predict our actions. If one's actions are not predictable in the context of society, then they are deemed irrational. A lot of children are considered irrational due to their inability to act predictably in society. They have not yet matured to be a contributing member of society. But why is 18 the age at which America recognizes children have matured enough to make independent, rational decisions? Think of this. In America, we are constantly tuning into the relationships of celebrities, shipping folks left and right, getting excited when certain celebrities hook up. When the 18 or 19-year-old gets with a much older celebrity in their 30s or 40s, many people don't even bat an eye. But really think about that. One day, a child is 17, but the next day, on their birthday, suddenly we deem them rational enough to date whole adults. I know I wasn't rational enough to make that decision on my 18th birthday, and honestly, I wasn't on my 19th birthday either. So age being directly correlated to maturity level is insanely superficial, in my opinion. Jean Piaget, a founding developmental psychologist, has a well-known theory of cognitive development that suggests that prior to age 11 or 12, most children are not capable of philosophical thinking. But I personally know some children who are very capable of this kind of thinking. And inversely, I've met some adults who struggle with this. So, this concept of a rational subject is based solely on the context of our society. And due to this lack of framework to judge if children can be consulted and involved in their medical care, who are parents and nurses to make that decision? What makes them the judges of rationality? A child has a right to be consulted and informed about the care they will receive, especially if they are curious. If a child is intelligent enough to ask about their care, they should know. And if they aren't, medical care should still be explained to a child before they experience the treatment. Children feel safe when they are informed, so they have a right to information. Speaking of,
honestly, I do think there are some subjects my child shouldn't learn in school. There's this big progressive push for better sex education, but my child shouldn't even be having sex. I don't want them to learn about that. I think it's better to keep them from getting curious. I'll teach my child when they're old enough. Oh, that was my parents' answer? Yeah, so I kind of already know a lot about sex. Between the internet and what my friends have said, I've learned quite a bit. It does kind of make me uncomfortable though. There's a lot of weird stuff on the internet, and sometimes the things my friends say don't make sense. As much as I think it would be weird to hear it taught in school, I would feel a lot more safe and confident seeking answers in the classroom. There's not a lot of information that I believe needs to be censored. With the internet nowadays, children will find the answers they seek. It would be better if more topics like sexuality, gender, sex education, and mental illness were covered in schools. Otherwise, children will learn false information or run into sketchy characters on the internet. School is a safe and well-controlled environment where children would be allowed to ask questions and gain a well-rounded education on these topics. It would be harmful to take that away from them.
I think in order to further understand this issue, we have to look at the motivation behind the parents' response. Let's assume that parents make decisions in the best interest of their children. Thus, they are motivated to keep their children safe in all situations. The parent that was interviewed doesn't want their child to be taught subjects in school they deem unsafe. For example, the parent believes that children shouldn't have sex, and rightly so. But then, the parent falls into the false assumption that if their child is taught sex education, they will start having sex. Unfortunately, studies have shown that no form of sex education has been shown to effectively convince teenagers not to have sex. Thus, The priority should not be on keeping this information from children, but on keeping children safe through proper education. The denial of information surrounding reproductive health only harms children. Like we discussed before, children should be consulted and involved in their medical care and treatment. Reproductive health falls in this category. Outlined in the United Nations, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, children have the right to access education. And in that education, they have a right to be taught and understand their other rights. This is so children can understand and communicate when their rights are being violated. If their rights are being violated, but the child has not been properly taught what their rights are, then it is much harder to get that child the help they need. Another right described in the Convention is the right to be protected from sexual exploitation and abuse. Currently, the abstinence-only sex education being taught in schools is a violation of this right. A comprehensive sex ed program provides children with the vocabulary to properly report if they are being sexually abused by someone in their life, effectively protecting them even in the most private of situations. Also, just as this child said in the interview, in this day and age, anything a child is not taught in school can most likely be found on the internet, which is a much less safe environment than the classroom. Children are often exploited by people on the internet, especially on websites that contain information that is not taught in school, but children are still curious about. To take away a child's right to education and information in school is to take away their right to protection from exploitation. Children need access to a safe learning environment, but the teacher and child knew this from the beginning. Now, though it's an assumption we made a few minutes ago, parents don't always have the child's best interests in mind.
I am the mother. I deserve to have custody over my child. I have a loving environment that their father could never give them. I birthed this child. Don't I have a right to them? Of course the court is going to decide to take my child away from me. They always have pity for the mother. But I'm financially stable. I have the house, the car, we live close to their school. I'm the reasonable option. I hate when my parents fight. I've always hated when my parents fight. I've talked to my therapist about this, and she says it's not healthy to be the mediator of this situation. I wish they'd talk to me. I wish they'd ask me how I feel. I am capable of deciding which situation I want to be in. They just won't let me in on the decision making.
Okay, so the parents didn't even answer the question because they were too caught up in their own issues to consider their child. That interview is probably our most obvious situation. The question being, are children capable of deciding which living situation is best for them? Is maybe a little too empirical. Because yes, children are capable of making decisions, and most of the time, children know which household they feel happier in. But sometimes, these decisions are not black and white. There is a lot of gray area in the definition of a good living situation for a child, especially when both options are good, and more likely when both options are bad. For this conversation, I'd like to bring in Immanuel Kant from Kantianism, David Thomasma with the Ethics of Caring for Vulnerable Individuals, and Robert Goodin with Protecting the Vulnerable. Also, I understand that Kant has been described as the most evil man in mankind's history, whose evilness apparently exceeded that of the worst dictators of all history. But honestly, for a guy who has come up with a moral obligation to promote happiness in people's lives, he can't be that bad, right? Okay, so let's define moral obligation and vulnerability. Moral obligation, according to Kant, is our duty to be motivated by a principle recognized by reason, rather than the desire for any expected consequence or emotional feeling which may cause us to act the way we do. This essentially means that we should automatically operate on a set of morals, and our decisions should not be made with certain outcomes in mind. We shouldn't use our decisions to manipulate the outcomes we desire, but simply make decisions that are morally correct. Next, vulnerability. It's a term that describes those who are less self-sufficient than they think, and less self-sufficient than the greater population. It also describes those who are facing inequities in regards to power, knowledge, or materials. I believe everyone would agree, minus a few exceptions, that children fall into this category. Let's do a little combining of these definitions into the principle of vulnerability. There is a moral obligation upon the stronger to protect vulnerable individuals, an obligation of altruism. In Protecting the Vulnerable by Robert Goodin, society bears specific responsibilities towards those who are more vulnerable to exploitation or harm, those whose vital interests are particularly vulnerable to our actions and choices. And what choice is more binding and impactful than a family's custody court case, where the child, though the individual with the least power, least materials, and least knowledge, has the greatest vital interest. In this situation, the child must be given the same amount of power as the parents. Take a step away from Kantianism, which is focused on the motivation behind decisions, and let's look at utilitarianism, which is focused on the consequences of decisions. In every situation, our decisions should prioritize the happiest outcomes. If we give the child time with both parents and the child will be happy, right? Well, half the time, the parents will be sad at the absence of their child, and the kid will live a hard childhood of bouncing back and forth between the parents. Or, one of the parents maintains a poor home life, and half the time, the child is greatly unhappy and may even be abused. Or, maybe that is the right decision, and the child is okay with bouncing back and forth, but the courts have now denied them access to both parents because the other parent was too scared to lose their child, fighting tooth and nail to keep all custody. All of these scenarios can be avoided by consulting the child. Let the child determine the outcome that would make them the happiest. The court can empirically look at both parents and decide which has a better home life based on income and assets. But money and material items don't matter if a child is unhappy with their situation. Their opinion should be held the highest in a custody case. Children know which parent is better for them, and we should trust them more. I understand that occasionally children are asked their opinions in court, but most of the time, where they go just comes down to which parent has a better lawyer. Okay, kids, so I think you've got the gist now. Essentially, you have a right to information. You are rational subjects capable of making decisions, and thus you have the right to be consulted and involved in decisions made regarding your life. Your vital interests need to be protected. Your interest in happiness, your interest in a comprehensive education, your interest in the medical care you are receiving. And what better person to protect your vital interests than you? Though you are vulnerable, though you may not have the power, knowledge, or materials of those less vulnerable than you, those people have an obligation to help you protect your vital interests. Don't let them forget that.